Welcome to the You're Not Crazy podcast, hosted by Jessica Knight, a certified life coach who specializes in healing from narcissistic and emotional abuse. This podcast is intended to help you identify manipulative and abusive behavior, set boundaries with yourself and others, and heal the relationship with yourself so you can learn to love in a healthy way. You can connect with Jessica and find additional resources, content, and coaching at emotionalabusecoach.com.
Before we begin, I just want to make a quick note. At the end of this episode, I spend the last 4 minutes walking through the way people work with me and where to find resources, my links, and my courses. If you are a returning listener or are already a client, you can absolutely skip that part. If you're new or trying to figure out what kind of support you need, it's there for you. It's the last 4 minutes. Thank you so much for being here. Today's episode is a little different. This is actually one of my Patreon-only episodes. I usually reserve these conversations for the Patreon community because people submit questions. But this month, I wanted to share this episode because as I was recording it, I realized that these are questions that I'm sure a lot of people are asking themselves all the time. These are the questions that I think are like sitting in our chest at 2 a.m. and cause the crazy shame spiral that we all get ourselves in. And so I'm sharing this episode, and this is a typical Q&A that I would post on my Patreon. This conversation is about the questions people are concerned about with cluster B personality disorders, and especially if we're sitting around wondering what is going on. I hope that this is helpful, and the link to find me on Patreon, if you are interested, is in the show notes. A very quick apology for the delay on this episode. It has been weather here in the northeast of the United States. So it just has led to a lot of schedule changes, a lot of last minute school cancellations or changes, and just unpredictable schedule, which doesn't help the brain that I have that likes predictability and consistency. And so this is the Patreon episode for January. And I will be posting this on the public podcast as well, but I am going to do another specific Patreon only podcast for February, but also I will do a second one because I did get a bunch of questions this round, and there was also a really good conversation happening on Substack, and there also is a pattern of abuse that I have picked up on for a while. And in one of the shows that I actually really like, Summer House, it's the New Yorker in me that probably is attracted to it. But I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing there because I think it actually really shows how emotional abuse weighs people down over time and the specific things that are alleged specifically against Amanda Batula. So that should be coming out all in February. But before I dive into the questions, I want to just briefly touch on that when we talk about pathological abuse, which is repeated patterns of coercive, manipulative behavior, and they stem from the personality structure of the person, not just pure communication or a conflict. Usually when we're talking about this, we're talking about coercive control, gaslighting, intermittent reinforcement, which is cycles of idealization and devaluation, blame shifting, chronic lack of accountability. It's the defining feature of this is the pattern and the power imbalance. It's not a bad week. It's not a bad fight. It's not we both lost our cool. This is a reoccurring system that's going on. And it's often linked to personality disorders, especially those within the cluster B, though not everyone with a personality disorder is abusive. And so when we talk about cluster B, and the reason I'm going through this is because a lot of the questions were related to cluster B. It's a group of personality disorders in the DSM categorized by dramatic, emotional, or erratic interpersonal styles. So what we see is, this is in borderline, BPD, narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, antisocial personality disorder, which is the clinical term for sociopathy, which is ASPD, and histrionic personality disorder, which is much less talked about, HPD, but it's a personality disorder that talks about attention seeking, a lot of emotional exaggeration, a lot of like approval driven behavior. So this is like some place where you would see somebody try to be seductive with someone else to get what they want, and a lot of shallow emotional expression. And so many people with these disorders don't seek treatment, but the traits matter more than labels. Always. I say that all the time. I don't care if somebody has diagnosis or not. I don't care if they have 8 of the characteristics, but not 9. What I care about is if it's abuse. Then abuse becomes likely in these situations because the personality disorder relates to low accountability, lack of empathy, entitlement, control. And so one thing that I have not talked about is that the core characteristic in pathological abuse is that the other person is treated as a function, not as a full separate human being. And so whether it's driven by abandonment, panic, which is BPD, ego regulation, which is more narcissistic, exploitation, which is antisocial, the relationship revolves around regulating the disordered individual, not a situation of mutual care. And this is the structural difference between a normal conflict and somebody's pathology. So I just want to name that before we go through the questions. And so one of the questions essentially boiled down to, was any of this real or was I just being used the entire time? The person gave me context, which it gives their personal details. So I'm not going to go through those. I'm just going to answer the question. It may have felt real to them in the moment, but that doesn't mean that it was deep or safe. And so the way that I think about this is that emotional intensity is not the same as emotional depth. Somebody with borderline traits can feel very real attachment, longing, fear, passion, love, but they lack the emotional regulation and identity and stability and consistency for that love to be actually secure. And so somebody, for example, with narcissistic traits may attach to you, meaning that you are valued for what you provided: validation, sex, money, status, emotional regulation, but not for who you are as a fully separate human being. There's a term for it that we don't know too much about, so I'm actually not going to explain it in detail, at least at this juncture, called instrumental attachment. And so something can feel real in birth and still not be relationally safe. And so if the good part was followed by chronic instability, manipulation, devaluation, or exploitation, then the relationship is not built on secure attachment, even if some of the genuine human emotions were there. The second question essentially boiled down to basically asking, like, all right, like, it feels like I connect with a lot of the borderline personality traits and what I'm dealing with in this relationship, but I actually wonder if they're a sociopath. That's, if I take the question and boil it down, that's what they're asking. And so this is my non-psychologist answer. Borderline traits are usually driven by emotional dysregulation and panic around being abandoned. And so they tend to be reactive, shame-fueled, and very chaotic. And there's often visible distress and fear around losing the relationship. Antisocial traits are marked by lack of remorse, calculated deception, so like they're always plotting and planning, and strategic manipulation. So the harm is like an instrument. They do it on purpose. We can see how like a narcissist and a sociopath may blend together a lot of the time. There's always overlap and there's always comorbidity. A person can show abandonment panic and like predatory behavior, but the distinctions are, is the harm impulsive and followed by genuine repair, or is it patterned? Does it feel strategic and remorseless? So if you feel like you're constantly resetting the cycle of abuse, then what you're stuck in is probably pathological love abuse with this person. And so the reason that it is hard to actually answer this question is because the traits blend together, they cluster together, right? So a lot of people do search for what is going on here and what does it look like and how can I understand it? My answer to you on this would be if you are in the place of searching for, is it this or is it that? Look at what you see. Look at what you see, right? Sometimes it might be helpful to read something about breaking free or like moving away from somebody who is borderline, which does lead to a very huge abandonment crisis a lot of the time for them and has to be done carefully. I work with people a lot on this because I lived it and didn't know it until I knew it. And then I was like, oh my God, I'm in this. And a sociopath, it's like when you start to fear what will come next with them in a lot of ways. And so look at the traits. If something resonates, that's great. If it doesn't, that's okay. But just look at the traits that you're seeing. The next question, again, boiling it down, is why did they get worse when I got stronger? I talk about this in my boundaries deep dive course all the time. This is the answer because boundaries disrupt control. When you stop chasing, reacting, and you start setting limits, the power dynamic in these relationships shifts. And if someone relies on control, validation, or emotional dominance, your strength can feel like abandonment or loss of leverage to them. And so what often follows is escalation, punishment, rage, smear campaigns, coldness. Healthy partners may not like a boundary. They might push back, but they adjust to the boundary. Pathological personalities often retaliate against any boundary. And so if somebody is increasing when you set a boundary, that actually means that they don't respect the boundary. They don't want the boundary. They don't believe that you should have a boundary. They don't care why you have to set it in the first place. So if they're escalating, it probably means your boundary is actually working. This is the last question that I'm going to go through today. And I really had to think about how to word this one because, like I said, I went through the person's question, which had personal details, then tried to figure out what the answer is. I actually had to take this one a few times and think about it. But the best and most blunt way that I can say it is, when does mental illness stop being an explanation and start being an excuse? The short answer is when harm becomes a repeated pattern without sustained work or accountability or change is when it's becoming an excuse, right? We all struggle with mental health. I don't care who you are. We all struggle with mental health. If you're listening to this podcast, I'm sure you struggle with mental health too, because, and this is probably something you're doing to try to understand what's going on so you then can figure out what kind of help you need to get or want to get. But if you're here, you likely have struggled with mental health. Mental health can explain distress, but it can't excuse repeated patterns of harm because even when I was at my most depressed, my go-to in my own life is I try and take as much space as possible. I don't want to be around the person. I can realize, in a relationship, I can be like, I'm not doing well. I need some space. I need to get like Humpty Dumpty back together again. I would say the last time that I felt like my mental health was quote unquote bad, like bad, was probably COVID because of all the changes and my outlets being taken away. For a while, we couldn't even safely go for walks. And so not being able to get outside, not being able to go to the gym regularly, not having the consistency in my day. Like so much changed immediately. And at first I thought like I was writing it out, but I think what I was doing, if I'm being honest, was pushing down my anxiety. So eventually we popped, and I started to realize, okay, I need to do something. I need to make a change. Maybe I need to explore this in a different way, right? This is what happens when all my outlets are taken away and stress increases. My daughter was also very little at the time. And so it's taking responsibility for it. And the thing I see most in these personalities that they don't take consistent responsibility. Their behavior doesn't change long term. They don't seem repair focused, right? Like it's totally okay to work on your mental health and to feel like, oh, I need something else. I need something different. You know what? This isn't working. but it's like a sense of ownership around, I'm doing this. I care. I don't want to affect you. If I affect you, like, let's find a way to communicate about that. But when somebody has a personality disorder, it involves a pattern of behavior. And if a pattern remains intact, despite all the things that are going on, that's kind of the structure of the person. So just because there's an explanation to it, it doesn't mean that they don't have the consequences of it, right? Like, explanation doesn't equal exemption from having consequences on other people, right? Like, if I think about like when I was growing up and my mom was struggling with mental health and was on antidepressants and, probably very high doses of them at the time, it didn't mean that it didn't have an effect on me as a child growing up. It did affect me. It affected me tremendously. It led to neglect. It led to allowing abuse. It led to me having to rely on myself from an extremely young age and having to learn things later in life that I probably should have been taught younger, or having to go through like being a woman growing up in the world and having to navigate that myself in my own head, which, if I really break it down, it's, I mean, that could be 3 more hours of this podcast, if I'm being honest. So the way that I think about it is that, are these people working on themselves? Are they being honest with themselves? Are they noticing what they're feeling and seeking appropriate help? Are they being honest when it's not working? Are their moods sort of fluctuating a bit? Or every time if there's a change, are they blaming it on you? If somebody is using their depression as a way to punish you all the time, that is a behavioral choice that they're doing. Like, if somebody says to you all the time, I can't believe you said that, you knew it would trigger me, when you say, did you pick up the quarters that you said you were going to for the laundry? Or, I just sent you an expense for $45. Can you please pay half? And then it turns into 66 emails. Like, these are situations that are not being managed in a healthy way, right? And in cluster B, it always goes back and forth, and back and forth. The way I like to look at it is that it has to go back to accountability. So the person acknowledges it. They don't minimize it. They don't blame you. They actively seek treatment, and they're trying to seek change. So because they want to feel better. When it starts to become an excuse is when the apologies reset the cycle. Therapy is like a badge of honor. Like, well, I'm in therapy. I used to have an ex that was like, I was in therapy for 2 hours today. And I'm like, that is great. However, it seems like you went into therapy and then talked about how I am triggering you for asking basic questions, or for saying, I don't want to do that thing, whatever it is that you suggested. These are situations where you're told to be more patient because of their trauma, and they weaponize your vulnerability all the time to avoid consequences. So the pattern continues, right? So accountability in my worldview is not words. It's actually what you do to disrupt the pattern. There's this really good Instagram video, and if I can find it, I will link it in the show notes, of Matthew McConaughey in an interview talking about apologies and sorry. And if you listen to one of my episodes, this I can link in the show notes, that's like super early on, about apologies. Apologies without a change in behavior are just words. They actually make me crazy. So if you say you're sorry, but you don't change your behavior, you're just manipulating someone. Matthew McConaughey says this in this video of like, if I say I'm sorry to you, this is me paraphrasing, I am telling you I'm going to change my behavior. I am telling you I'm realizing something, and it is now my job to take the steps to change that. That's accountability. This is not. So many people say, I can't help it. Many people excuse other people's behavior with, I can't help it. But I want to be clear. The first time, maybe they can't help it. But patterns explain what happens next, right? So we know that if it happens once and it continues to happen, you're in a pattern. So if somebody rages gaslights you, threatens you, controls you, lies, and then says, I couldn't help it. That's the real test, right? Are they creating safeguards so it doesn't happen again? I used to have a partner that every time I didn't do the thing that he wanted me to do, and like the example that is popping up in my mind is the amount of times he would say, I love you. And I would say, it really started to it was like countless and countless and countless times a day. I remember one time I counted, I think it was like well into the high 20s. And say we were talking about like, what do you want to get for dinner? This is all in text messages. And his response would be like, I love you so much. If he said, how about we order X? And I replied first to the ordering, but not the I love you. It was an issue of how I didn't love him. This went on for a long time. We talked about it in couples therapy. I said, I feel like I'm always being tested. And sometimes, especially if I'm running in between things, I just want to reply to the logistical thing. And I'll give you a longer response later, but why do you need to hear I love you 29 times a day? Isn't my behavior showing you that? Or the other 20 times I'm saying it? The structural change couldn't happen. He just kept saying that it just triggers him. So it meant that there couldn't be any consequences. We couldn't talk about it. Boundaries weren't respected. The I can't help it was functioning as a protection from accountability. And so even with people with really severe dysregulation can still choose to seek help, stay in therapy, avoid triggers. And so one of the clearest markers, one of the clearest explanations that I can give you is actually to look at the repetition. Has this happened before? Has the apology script been repeated? Has therapy been promised before? Does the cycle restart after calm periods? And do they escalate when you set boundaries? And if yes, you're not looking at somebody who is just having communication issues or misunderstanding, you're actually entrenched in a pattern. Mental illness can coexist with abuse, but abuse becomes cyclical and predictable. We're not talking about just symptoms anymore. And I know that this question feels heavy because it carries such a moral weight. So many of us fear being cruel, but refusing abuse is not cruelty. Having boundaries is not you abandoning somebody or leaving them in a tough place. They are responsible for their mental health too. I hope that this was helpful. I really enjoy reading your questions, hearing your stories, and seeing where you are with all of this. And so if this prompted more questions, please use the link that is in the notes to fill it out. And I'm happy to get back to you on the next episode. I imagine this one actually might prompt a follow-up episode. So if there are questions, again, happy to answer them. And thank you so much for being a member of my Patreon community. It means the world to me. If this episode resonated and you're realizing that what you're dealing with isn't just stress or miscommunication, there are ways to get support that don't minimize what you're experiencing. I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes telling you about my offerings, because at the core of my business is one-on-one coaching. The podcast is something that I do because I do like being able to help a broader audience, but the truth is that the core of my work is really coaching and providing other offerings so that people can begin to heal. At the center of everything I do is one-on-one coaching. That's where I slow things down, listen closely, and help you make sense of what's happening in your specific situation. It's not a template. It's not just based on theories, but it's really focused on your real life. Some people start with a one-time validation call. That is a single focus session where we look at one specific situation or pattern that you're struggling with. And the goal isn't to fix your life or push you into decisions. It's to help you name what's happening, put it into context of reality, help you notice where you are in it, and offer some feedback and tools to how to navigate it. I also offer an intro call. The intro call used to be called the clarity call, and it's a short call where you can share what's going on for you, and I can explain how I work and whether I'm the right fit for your situation. There's no obligation to continue after that. It's simply a way for us to get on the same page before moving forward. For people who need ongoing support, I offer weekly or biweekly coaching. This is especially helpful if you're navigating emotional abuse, trauma bond, high conflict divorce, or custody and co-parenting with a difficult or controlling person. Ongoing work allows us to track patterns over time, stay anchored when things escalate, and make decisions in a way that protects your nervous system and your long-term stability. All of my coaching options can be found on my websites, emotionalabusecoach.com and highconflictdivorcecoaching.com. Both links are available in the show notes of this episode. In addition to one-on-one coaching, I offer several self-paced courses and programs. They're called Divorcing a Narcissist 101, How to Document for Family Court, the Emotional Abuse Breakthrough Course, Setting Boundaries with a Narcissist, and Unhooked, which is my program and private podcast that walks you through the full cycle of abuse, helps you map it out in your relationship, and shows you how to begin to break free from the trauma bond. I also write on Substack, where I explore topics like trauma bonding, emotional abuse, coercive control, high conflict divorce, and the cluster B dynamics. There's a free option and a paid membership that offers deeper dives, Q&As, and additional resources. Everything that I do and everything that I built is around one core truth and message that you're not crazy, you shouldn't feel crazy, and that even though I can see patterns in what you're experiencing, it doesn't mean that it's normal. It's not healthy. My work is really about helping you understand what's happening and begin to trust yourself again. All of the links that I shared are in my show notes, and I really appreciate you being here.